Let me tell you what actually bothers me about the Turkey trip. Not the surgeries, not the swelling, not even the dramatic phone calls. What bothers me is the way the whole thing has been remembered, because I think most of the conversation around it has been either too mean or too soft, and nobody has really sat down and asked the harder question: what was the actual dynamic between these two women? And why did it produce such completely different outcomes from what looked like an identical experience? That's what this video is about. I'm not here to call Stacy a villain. I'm also not here to excuse her. What I want to do is actually look at what happened in Turkey, what we saw on camera, what the pattern of their relationship suggests, and where my own read differs from the way fans have been framing this for years. Because I think the Stacey sabotaged Darcy narrative is partly right and mostly wrong. And I think the more honest version of events is actually sadder and more complicated than the idea of one twin consciously plotting against the other. So, let's start from the beginning. For anyone who doesn't follow Darcey and Stacey Silva with the kind of attention their show probably doesn't deserve, here's what you need to know. The Silva sisters are twins who became reality TV fixtures through the 90-Day Fiancé franchise, eventually getting their own spin-off called, straightforwardly, Darcey and Stacey. The show follows their lives, their relationships, their cosmetic procedures, and their genuinely complicated bond as sisters who are inseparable in a way that sometimes looks like love and sometimes looks like something more tangled than that. Darcy, the older twin by a few minutes, has been the more visibly chaotic presence on the show. Her relationships have been the central drama of most of her screen time, first with Jesse Master, then with Tom Brooks, then with Georgi, a Bulgarian man she met and got engaged to relatively quickly. Stacy has been the comparatively grounded one, married to Florian Sukaj, an Albanian man she met while he was working as a model. Their dynamic on camera has always involved Stacy positioning herself as the more stable, more sorted twin, the one who has things figured out, the one looking out for her sister. Whether that positioning reflects reality is a question the show has been quietly asking since it started. The Turkey trip happened during a season where both sisters decided to travel there for cosmetic procedures. This is not unusual for either of them. Both have spoken openly about their relationship with cosmetic surgery and their desire to, in their words, look and feel their best. Turkey has become a popular destination for medical tourism, particularly for procedures that are significantly more affordable there than in the United States, and both sisters were going for extensive work. I'm not going to speculate about exactly what was done, because the show covered some of it, but not all of it, and I don't want to fill in the gaps with guesswork about anyone's medical decisions. What I can say is that going into Turkey, Darcy's relationship with Georgi was already unstable. That's not an interpretation. That was the entire plot of the preceding episodes. Georgi had been at the center of ongoing suspicion, partly about his motives for the relationship, and partly about what he was up to when Darcy wasn't watching. Stacy had been vocal about her distrust of Georgi for most of their time on screen together, and Darcy had been caught in the middle of that, defending Georgi to her sister while simultaneously showing signs of her own anxiety about the relationship. None of that started in Turkey. Turkey was just where it became impossible to contain. Here's what I think is actually true about Stacy's role in all of this, and I want to be careful here because I'm genuinely speculating. I do not believe Stacy sat down before the trip and thought, I'm going to destroy Darcy's peace of mind so that I look better by comparison. That is the most dramatic possible interpretation of what happened, and dramatic interpretations tend to flatten real human behavior into something more legible but less accurate. What I think is more likely is something messier and in some ways harder to argue with. Stacy has real concerns about Georgi. Some of those concerns appear to be legitimate, and she expresses those concerns in a way that does not account for the timing, the context, or the effect they have on her sister. Whether that's thoughtlessness or something more calculated, I genuinely can't say from what I've seen on camera. Reality TV editing makes it nearly impossible to assess intent. What I can assess is the impact, and the impact of Stacy's behavior around the Turkey trip was that Darcy went into a major medical procedure in a state of serious emotional distress. That matters. And I don't think it's been discussed as seriously as it should be. There's a thing that happens in emotionally enmeshed relationships, particularly between siblings, where one person's expression of concern becomes indistinguishable from control. Stacy's worry about Georgi could be genuine. I have no reason to think it isn't, but I'm worried about your boyfriend, and I'm going to raise every concern I have about your boyfriend right now, in this moment, hours before your surgery, while we're in a foreign country and you can't exactly remove yourself from the situation, are very different things. The first is sisterly. The second is, at best, extremely poor judgment. And the thing I keep coming back to is that Stacy knows Darcy. She has known her for their entire lives. She knows how Darcy responds to stress. She knows that Darcy's relationship anxiety is intense, and that when it gets activated, Darcy is not going to just take a breath and set it aside until after her recovery. That's not who Darcy is. Stacy has watched Darcy spiral over relationships for years. So when she raises Georgi concerns in the middle of a medical trip, the question I can't fully answer is whether she genuinely didn't think about the timing, or whether on some level she did, and raised them anyway. I'm not comfortable saying Stacy consciously wanted Darcy to suffer, but I'm also not comfortable with the idea that the timing was purely accidental. My honest read is somewhere in between, and that middle space is actually the uncomfortable part. Now, let's talk about what Darcy's role in this was, because I think the conversation around the Turkey trip makes Darcy too passive. She's often framed as a victim of her sister's meddling, which is partly fair, but it also misses something real about how Darcy moves through the world. Darcy made choices in Turkey. She chose to engage with the Georgi situation fully during a time when her physical recovery had to be the priority. She chose to have an emotionally devastating phone call rather than saying, "I hear you. This is a conversation we need to have, but I cannot have it right now." I'm not saying that would have been easy. It clearly wouldn't have been. Darcy is not someone who can easily compartmentalize, and I don't think most people are. But she does have agency, and the narrative that frames her as purely at the mercy of her sister doesn't quite capture the full picture. What I think is closer to the truth is that Darcy has spent a lot of her adult life in an emotional posture that makes her extremely reactive to relationship threats. That's not a character flaw so much as a pattern that comes from somewhere real, probably from a history of relationships where her anxiety turned out to be justified. When Stacy introduces doubt about Georgi, Darcy doesn't process it and sets it aside because she can't. Her nervous system treats it as an emergency. And emergencies are not good preconditions for healing from surgery. The result, at least as it played out on screen, was that Darcy's recovery looked significantly more difficult than Stacy's. There was more visible distress, more swelling was talked about, and Darcy's emotional state was clearly not in a good place throughout the process. Stacy, meanwhile, was doing better, whether that's because Stacy was genuinely more at peace, or because the cameras caught them in different moments, or because Stacy is simply a more private person about her struggles. I don't know. But the visual contrast was there, and it fed a very specific narrative. That narrative being, Stacy thrives, Darcy flounders. Stacy has it together. Darcy is a mess. Stacy wins. And here's where I want to push back on something the fan community does a lot. There's a tendency to assume that because Stacy appears more stable, she is more stable. And that because Darcy appears more chaotic, her chaos is the whole story. But stability that comes from a partner who was, by what was actually documented on the show, caught in footage that raised serious questions about fidelity, is not the same thing as genuine stability. Stacy's marriage to Florian was not without its own significant drama. That drama was on camera. And yet, the narrative that Stacy is the put-together twin persists, partly because Stacy projects it, and partly because Darcy's visible chaos makes it easy to believe by comparison. I think there's something worth naming about how the show itself participates in this. Darcey and Stacey as a production has a vested interest in Darcy being dramatic, because Darcy being dramatic is good television. The edit that makes Darcy look like she's always falling apart serves the show's needs. That doesn't mean it's false. But it does mean we're getting a shaped version of events, and we should hold that lightly when we're making sweeping judgments about either of these women's lives. What does seem clearly documentable is that the twin dynamic between Darcy and Stacy is something neither of them has fully reckoned with on camera. They describe their relationship in terms of closeness, of being each other's best friend, of an unbreakable bond. And I think all of that is true. I also think that when two people are that close, and one of them has spent their whole life being perceived as the more put-together one, there are psychological dynamics at play that are genuinely complicated and that neither party may be fully conscious of. Competition is one of those dynamics, and I don't mean the conscious kind where you decide to outperform someone. I mean the unconscious kind where your sense of self is built in comparison to one specific person, and that person's struggles can feel, on some level, that you'd never admit to, like confirmation that you're doing better. I'm not saying Stacy enjoys Darcey's suffering. I don't have evidence of that. But I am saying that in a relationship structured around comparison, the comparison doesn't stop just because one sister is going through something hard. The Georgi situation, stripped of the most dramatic framing, is this. Stacy had concerns about Darcey's fiancé. She raised those concerns. She raised them at a time and in a way that made Darcey's already difficult situation significantly worse. Darcey, rather than deferring the conversation, engaged with it fully and let it consume her in a moment when she genuinely needed to be focused on recovery. Georgi was caught in the middle of all of it, and the relationship took serious damage in Turkey, damage that Darcey then had to navigate while also recovering physically. What happened when the bandages came off and Darcey came home is something the show covered in its own way. And what was visible was a woman who looked like she was in more distress than she'd gone in with. The relationship with Georgi did continue, which tells you something about how strong the pull of that connection was for Darcey, even after everything that happened in Turkey. I want to say something about that, because I think it gets used against Darcey in ways that aren't quite fair. She went back to Georgi after a brutal experience in which he became the center of a crisis, and some people read that as weakness or as proof that she doesn't value herself. My reading is a little different. I think Darcey, like a lot of people who have had relationships go badly, has a very high tolerance for uncertainty in relationships and a very low tolerance for being alone with her own anxiety. That's not unusual, and going back to a relationship that you still believe in, even after a hard stretch, isn't necessarily self-destructive. It might be, but it's not automatic. What does look like a harder pattern to break is the thing with Stacy. Because here's the situation. The person in Darcey's life who has the most influence over her emotional state is also the person whose involvement in her life has, at least on camera, repeatedly coincided with Darcey's worst moments. That's not necessarily Stacy's fault, but it is a pattern. And Darcey keeps coming back to Stacy, keeps relying on her, keeps treating her as the North Star for what Darcey herself should want and expect from her own life. That's the codependency piece, and I think it's the most real part of the Turkey story. Darcey and Stacy's bond is genuine. I believe that completely, but genuine bonds can still be unhealthy, and I think what we've watched over multiple seasons is two women who genuinely love each other, but whose relationship has a structural problem built into it. Stacy's identity is partly constructed around being the better twin, not consciously, maybe not maliciously, but structurally. And Darcey's identity is partly constructed around needing Stacy's approval. That combination doesn't lead anywhere good, and Turkey is one of the clearest examples of what it looks like when it plays out in a high-stakes situation. Now, let me take the other side of this seriously, because I think it deserves it. The most charitable interpretation of Stacy's behavior in Turkey is this. She is a protective older sibling who had information about Georgi that she genuinely believed Darcey needed to hear, and she chose to share it because she thought staying silent would be the worst choice. That's not an unreasonable position. If you believe someone your sister loves is going to hurt her, the argument for saying nothing on the grounds of timing is actually a hard one to make. The argument for speaking up, even at a bad time, is that you can't always wait for the right moment, and sometimes the wrong moment is the only one you have. I can also acknowledge that we are watching this through a television edit, and reality TV edits are built around drama. It is entirely possible that there were conversations between Darcey and Stacey in Turkey that were measured, careful, and supportive, and that those conversations ended up on the cutting room floor because they don't make for compelling viewing. The show has an interest in showing Darcey at her most vulnerable and Stacey at her most pointed, because that creates conflict, and conflict creates ratings. That's not a defense of either sister's choices. But it is a reason to be a little cautious about treating everything we saw as a transparent window into their actual relationship. People who love Stacy would say she's been looking out for Darcy for her entire life, that she sees patterns in Darcy's relationships that Darcy can't see because she's inside them, and that the thing we're calling interference is actually just sisterly concern expressed badly. That argument has merit. I just think it's incomplete. So where does that leave us? Honestly, I think the Turkey trip is a pretty good encapsulation of everything that's interesting and frustrating about watching Darcy and Stacey as public figures. The show works because their bond is real, the tension between them is real, and both of their struggles are real. The easy version is to turn Stacey into a villain and Darcy into a victim, and I get why that narrative is satisfying, because it has a clear shape and a clear moral. But I don't think it's quite right. What I actually believe, having spent more time thinking about this than I'll ever fully admit, is that Stacey's behavior in Turkey caused real harm to her sister, whether or not she intended it. I believe Darcy's suffering during and after that trip was genuine. I also believe that Darcy's patterns, her need for validation, her tendency to let relationship anxiety override everything else, are hers to work on and have been hers to work on for a long time. And I believe the twin dynamic is the underlying thing that neither of them has been fully honest about on camera, because being fully honest about it would require acknowledging something neither of them seems ready to look at directly. There is something genuinely sad about watching two people who clearly love each other be stuck in a structure that keeps producing pain for both of them. Stacy isn't happy being the responsible one all the time. Darcy isn't happy being the chaotic one all the time. Those roles are assigned by comparison to each other, and as long as they stay in comparison to each other, neither of them gets to just be a person without a ranking. Turkey didn't create that dynamic. It just made it very visible under very high-stakes conditions. And the fact that we're still talking about it years later suggests that the people watching the show recognized something real in it, even if the conversation around it has mostly stayed at the level of did she or didn't she? My answer is, it's the wrong question. The right question is what kind of relationship keeps producing these moments, and what it would take for either of them to genuinely step back from it. That's harder to answer, and the show isn't designed to answer it. The show is designed to put them back in the same situations and see what happens, which means, unless something changes off camera that we don't get to see, the pattern is probably going to keep going. That's not a happy ending, but I think it's the honest one.